I stood outside my son Michael's house on my 68th birthday, holding my breath as I looked through the half-open door. There it was, my birthday card, still sealed, buried beneath a pile of unopened mail like it meant nothing. Emily had walked past it, again and again. She didn't know that inside that simple envelope wasn't just a card. It was the deed to the only piece of land that could save their home from foreclosure. And just like that, the one thing she desperately needed was the one thing she chose to ignore. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, go ahead and like this video. And tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it there? I read every single comment because sometimes strangers understand us better than our own family does. I'm Beverly Chandler. I turned 68 that morning, though you wouldn't have known it by the way the day unfolded. There was a time when birthdays meant something, not presents or parties. I outgrew those years ago, but phone calls, laughter, the sound of my son Michael's voice before he got too busy building a life that no longer seemed to include me. I used to be the center of his world. After my husband Richard passed away 8 years ago, Michael became everything to me. Not in a suffocating way. I wasn't one of those mothers, but in the quiet, steady way that widows learn to hold on to what they have left. We talked every Sunday. He'd come by with coffee, sometimes bring little Ethan when he was still small enough to run into my arms without hesitation. Back then, things were simple. Then Emily came into his life. At first, I truly wanted to love her. I remember the first time Michael introduced us. She stood in my doorway in a pale blue dress, her posture straight, her smile polite but measured. There was something about her that I couldn't quite place. Not unkind, just guarded, like she had already decided who I was before I even spoke. Still, I welcomed her in. I cooked dinner that night, roast chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes. The kind of meal that used to bring my own family together when Richard was still alive. Emily complimented the food, but it felt rehearsed, like something you say out of obligation rather than warmth. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Chandler," she said. I remember gently correcting her. "Please call me Beverly." She smiled, but she never did. That was the first sign. Over the years, the distance between us didn't happen all at once. It was subtle, quiet. The kind of change that creeps in so slowly you almost convince yourself it isn't real. When Ethan was born, I thought things might soften. A baby has a way of bringing people together. For a while it did. I was invited over more often. I helped with diapers, babysat when they needed a night out. I held that little boy for hours, humming the same lullabies I once sang to Michael. But even then there were moments, small ones, moments where I would offer a suggestion how to soothe Ethan when he cried or how to get him to sleep through the night, and I'd catch the flicker in Emily's eyes. Not anger, something sharper. Judgment. "You don't have to do things the old-fashioned way," she once told me, her voice calm but firm. I had smiled and nodded. Of course. I just thought it might help. But after that, I spoke less. I told myself it was generational differences, that young mothers did things differently now, that I needed to step back, give them space. And I did. But stepping back didn't fix things. If anything, it made me disappear faster. Michael changed too, though I don't think he realized it. He became quieter around me, more careful with his words. Conversations that once flowed easily turned into polite exchanges. "How's work, Mom?" "It's fine, sweetheart." "How's everything else?" "Oh, you know the same." We stopped talking about anything real. And Emily, she stopped trying altogether. She never yelled, never created scenes. In some ways that made it worse, because it meant I could never point to a single moment and say, "That's when everything broke." Instead, it was 1,000 tiny fractures. A missed invitation here, a short reply there, a door that used to stay open slowly closing. The hardest part wasn't the distance. It was the feeling that I had done something wrong and no one would tell me what it was. I remember one afternoon about 3 years ago, when everything shifted in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. I had stopped by unannounced. I used to do that all the time, just drop off cookies or a casserole check-in, see how they were doing. That day, I had baked Ethan's favorite chocolate chip cookies. I could still picture his little face lighting up when he saw me at the door. But when Emily opened it, her expression tightened. "Oh, Beverly," she said, like my presence was an inconvenience she hadn't prepared for. "I was just in the neighborhood," I replied, holding up the container with a hopeful smile. "I thought Ethan might like these." She hesitated before stepping aside to let me in. Inside, the house felt different. Not physically, it was still the same furniture, the same family photos, but emotionally, like I had walked into a space where I no longer belonged. Ethan came running down the hallway when he heard my voice. "Grandma!" he shouted, throwing his arms around me. In that moment, everything felt okay again. But then I noticed the way Emily watched us. Not with warmth, with caution, as if I were crossing a line simply by loving my own grandson. Later that afternoon, after Ethan had gone to his room, Emily pulled me aside. "I'd appreciate it if you called before coming over," she said. Her tone wasn't loud, but it was firm, final. I blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, of course. I didn't realize. We have our routines," she continued. "It's just easier that way." "Easier. For them. Not for me." I nodded, swallowing the sting in my chest. "I understand." And I did Callie chest. "I understand." And I did call after that. Every time. But slowly, the invitations stopped coming altogether. Birthdays were reduced to text messages. Holidays became complicated. And somewhere along the way, I went from being Michael's mother to being an outsider looking in. So when I stood outside that door on my 68th birthday, staring at that unopened card sitting on their table, it wasn't just about the envelope. It was about everything that had led up to that moment. Every silence, every misunderstanding, every time I chose to step back, hoping they would one day step toward me. But they never did. And the most painful part, Emily didn't even realize what she was ignoring. Not just the card, but the last piece of trust I had left to give. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Even after everything, the distance, the silence, the way Emily barely looked at me unless she had to, I never stopped paying attention. That's what mothers do. We notice the things no one says out loud. And lately, something had been wrong. I first sensed it in Michael's voice. It started with the missed Sunday calls, then the shorter conversations, then the way he'd rush off the phone like there was something more important waiting on the other end, something heavier than work, heavier than everyday life. At first, I told myself not to read into it, but a mother knows. One evening, about 3 months before my birthday, I called him unexpectedly. He picked up on the third ring. "Hey, Mom," he said, but his voice was distracted, tight. "Is everything all right?" I asked gently. Yeah, everything's fine," he replied too quickly. I had heard that tone before, not as a mother, but as a wife. Richard used to use it whenever he was trying to shield me from something, a problem, a worry, something he thought he had to handle alone, and it never meant things were fine. "I haven't heard from you in a while," I continued. "I just wanted to check in." "I've just been busy," he said. "Work's been a lot." There was a pause. Then faintly, I heard Emily's voice in the background. Not words, just the sound of tension, like something had been said before he picked up the phone. "Michael," I said softly, "you know, you can tell me if something's wrong." Another pause, longer this time. For a moment, I thought he might finally say it, but then he exhaled and said, "I gotta go, Mom. I'll call you later, okay?" He never did. That was the moment I knew. Something wasn't just wrong. It was serious. After that, I started paying closer attention. Not in an intrusive way, but in the quiet, observant way I'd learned over a lifetime of caring for people. I drove by their house one afternoon under the pretense of running errands. Their front yard, once neat and trimmed, looked neglected. The grass had grown uneven. The flower beds Emily used to take pride in were dry, the petals shriveled under the late summer sun. That alone told me something. Emily cared about appearances, about order. If she had let things slip, it meant her focus was elsewhere. Inside through the window, I could see Michael sitting at the kitchen table. Papers spread out in front of him, his head in his hands. I didn't knock. I just watched for a moment and then drove away. Because sometimes seeing too much without being invited feels like crossing a line you can't come back from. But that image stayed with me. Days later, I ran into someone I hadn't expected. Mrs. Patterson, the woman who lived 2 houses down from Michael and Emily. We exchanged polite smiles at the grocery store, the kind you give acquaintances you don't see often enough to know well. "How's Michael?" she asked casually as we stood in line. "He's good," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow. She hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "I hope you don't mind me saying," she began, lowering her voice, "but I've seen some people from the bank stopping by their house lately." My heart tightened. "The bank," I repeated. She nodded. "Yes, I don't know the details, of course. I hope you don't mind me saying," she began, lowering her voice, "but I've seen some people from the bank stopping by their house lately." My heart tightened. "The bank," I repeated. She nodded. "Yes, I don't know the details, of course, but it didn't look like routine visits." I forced a smile, thanked her, and finished checking out. But inside, everything shifted. That night, I couldn't sleep. The pieces started coming together in ways I didn't want them to. Michael's voice, the tension, the papers on the table, the neglected yard, the bank. By morning, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I went through Richard's old files. After he passed, I had kept everything organized. Every document, every piece of paperwork neatly filed away in labeled folders. It was my way of holding on to him, of keeping some sense of control in a world that had suddenly felt very uncertain. And among those files was something I hadn't thought about in a long time. A property. Not just any property. A piece of land Richard had inherited from his father years before we met. It wasn't large, and it wasn't developed, but it was valuable. The kind of asset that sits quietly in the background until someone realizes what it's worth. I remember the night Richard told me about it. We were sitting at the kitchen table, much like Michael had been in that fleeting glimpse I caught. "I've been thinking," Richard said, sliding a folder toward me, "about the future, about Michael." I opened the folder and saw the documents. "This land," he continued, "it's something we can pass down, a safety net." I looked up at him. "Why not put it in Michael's name now?" Richard shook his head. "Because timing matters," he said, "and so does responsibility." I didn't fully understand back then, but I trusted him, and when he passed, he left the decision in my hands. Legally, the property was mine, but emotionally, it was meant for Michael, for his future, for his family, for a moment exactly like this. As I sat at my dining table that morning, the documents spread out in front of me, I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. Because suddenly, everything made sense. Emily had been searching for something. I remembered overhearing fragments of conversations months ago, mentions of assets, options, something Richard left behind. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it, but now I realized the truth. She knew the land existed, but she didn't know where it was. And she didn't know that I was the one holding it. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the papers. If Michael and Emily were truly in trouble, if the bank was already involved, then this land could be the difference between losing everything and starting over. It could save their home, their stability, their future. But there was a problem, a complicated one, because this wasn't just about handing over a document. This was about trust. And trust was the one thing we no longer had. I thought about Emily, about the way she looked at me, about the distance, the coldness, the unspoken accusations in her eyes. If I simply showed up with the deed in hand, would she even believe me? Or would she see it as another attempt to control their lives? Another intrusion? Another reason to push me further away? I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the table. For the first time in years, I felt completely unsure of what to do. Because helping them wasn't the hard part. The hard part was knowing whether they would even accept it. And as much as it hurt to admit, I wasn't sure Emily ever would. I didn't tell anyone. Not Michael, not Emily, not even myself, not fully, not in a way that felt like a decision. It was more like a quiet postponement, a pause stretched longer than it should have been. Because the truth was, the land Richard left behind wasn't just a piece of property. It was a promise. And promises, especially the ones made between husbands and wives in the final years of life, carry a weight that doesn't fade with time. I remember the last conversation Richard and I had about it. It was late autumn. The air outside had turned crisp, and the leaves in our backyard were beginning to fall in slow, quiet spirals. He had been weaker then, though he tried not to show it. We were sitting by the window. He had that same folder in his hands, the one now resting on my dining table all these years later. "Beverly," he said, his voice softer than usual, "there's something I need you to understand." I turned to him, already feeling the heaviness in his tone. "This land," he continued, tapping the folder gently, "it's not just something to give away when it becomes convenient." I frowned slightly. "It's for Michael, isn't it?" "Yes," he said, "but not just for him as an individual. For his family. For the life he builds." I remember folding my hands in my lap. "I don't see the difference." He smiled faintly, but there was sadness in it. "You will," he said. Then he leaned back, his eyes drifting toward the window, as if he were searching for the right words in the distance. "Timing matters, Beverly. People don't always know what they need until they're forced to face what they might lose." His words lingered in the room like something unfinished. "And when that moment comes," he added, turning back to me, "that's when the decision should be made." I hesitated. "You want me to decide when?" He nodded. "Based on what?" I asked. "Based on whether giving it will truly help them or simply enable them." At the time, I didn't fully grasp what he meant. But now, sitting alone with those same papers years later, I finally did. Because helping isn't always about handing something over. Sometimes it's about waiting. And waiting is the hardest thing a mother can do. I ran my fingers along the edge of the deed, tracing the faded ink of Richard's signature. Legally, everything was clear. The land was mine. There were no disputes, no complications, at least not on paper. But emotionally, it was far more complicated. Because the condition Richard had spoken about, the one he never wrote down, but made me promise to honor, was simple in theory and almost impossible in practice. The land was to go to Michael, but only when his family was strong enough to hold it together. Not just financially, emotionally. united, at peace. I let out a slow breath, leaning back in my chair. If I were being honest with myself, they weren't there. Not even close. Michael was distant, withdrawn, carrying burdens he refused to share. Emily, she didn't trust me, didn't want me, and perhaps worse, didn't believe she needed me. And the tension between them, I could feel it without even being in the room. If I handed over the deed now, it might solve one problem, the financial one. But what about everything else? What about the fractures already forming beneath the surface? Would the land save them? Or simply delay something deeper from breaking? That question haunted me. For days, I moved through my routine with that weight pressing quietly against my chest. I made coffee in the mornings and let it grow cold. I turned on the television for noise, but didn't hear a single word. I picked up the phone more than once to call Michael and set it back down every time. Because I didn't trust myself not to say too much. And once something like that is said, you can't take it back. One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the hallway closet. The same closet where I kept all of Richard's things that I couldn't bear to part with. His old jackets, his tools, a pair of worn leather gloves he used every winter. I opened the door slowly, breathing in that faint, familiar scent that still lingered after all these years. For a moment, I closed my eyes. "Richard," I whispered softly, "what would you do?" Of course, there was no answer. There never is. But sometimes, asking the question is enough to bring clarity. And in that quiet moment, something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. I realized that I had been looking at this the wrong way. I had been thinking of the land as something to give or not give, a decision between action and inaction. But maybe there was another way, a way that didn't force me to choose between helping them and protecting them, a way that placed the responsibility not on me, but on them. That's when the idea came to me. Simple. Almost too simple. And yet, it felt right. A birthday card. I let out a small, almost disbelieving laugh. Of all things, a birthday card, the kind people open without thinking, the kind that doesn't feel heavy or complicated or loaded with expectation. Something small, something ordinary, something easy to ignore or easy to accept. If I placed the deed inside the card along with a letter explaining everything, not just the land, but Richard's wishes, the reason I had waited, the truth I had never been able to say out loud, then the choice wouldn't be mine anymore. It would be theirs, Emily's, Michael's. They could open it, or they could leave it sitting there untouched. They could read my words, or continue believing the version of me they had built in their minds. They could accept what I was offering, or reject it. But either way, they would be choosing. And somehow that felt fair. More than fair. It felt like the only way forward. I walked back to the dining table, the decision settling into me with a quiet certainty I hadn't felt in weeks. Carefully, I gathered the documents, smoothed them out, placed them back into the folder. Then I went to my desk and pulled out a blank card. It was simple. White. Nothing elaborate. Just a small bouquet of printed flowers on the front. I turned it over in my hands, thinking about what I would write, because the deed alone wouldn't be enough. Not for Emily. Not for the distance between us. If this was going to work. She needed to understand, not just what I was giving, but why I had waited so long. And for the first time in years, I realized I was ready to tell her everything. I sat at my desk for a long time before I wrote the first word. The card lay open in front of me, its blank interior, somehow more intimidating than any conversation I had ever avoided. It's strange, isn't it? How speaking your heart on paper can feel harder than saying it out loud, because on paper, there's no turning back, no softening the edges, no pretending you didn't mean it. Whatever I wrote, Emily would read, if she chose to. I picked up my pen, then put it down again. What do you say to someone who has already decided who you are? How do you rewrite years of silence in a single letter? I closed my eyes and thought about her, not the version of Emily shaped by distance and resentment, but the woman she was when I first met her. The one who stood in my doorway, polite but guarded, trying to find her place in a family she didn't fully trust. Maybe she had been protecting herself all along. And maybe in my own quiet way, I had been doing the same. That thought softened something in me. When I picked up the pen again, my hand felt steadier. I didn't start with explanations. I started with honesty. Dear Emily, I wrote, pausing after her name. Not Dear Mrs. Chandler, not anything formal. Just Emily. Because if this was going to mean anything, it had to be real. I don't know if you'll ever read this, I continued, but if you do, I hope you'll hear me the way I've always wanted to be heard. Not as someone trying to interfere in your life, but as someone who has been trying in her own imperfect way to love you. I stopped, my chest tightening. That was the truth. Not polished, not perfect, but real. I kept writing. I know I haven't always made things easy for you. There were times I spoke when I should have listened, times I offered advice when what you needed was space. For that, I am truly sorry. The word sorry felt heavier than I expected. Because it wasn't just for her. It was for all the moments I had replayed in my mind, wondering what I could have done differently. I also know I wrote that somewhere along the way, we both stopped trying to understand each other. And that distance, it didn't happen overnight. It grew quietly in the things we didn't say. My eyes blurred for a moment, and I had to pause again. I hadn't planned on being this vulnerable. But once the words started, they didn't stop. I want you to know something you may not believe. I continued. I have never wanted to control your life. I have never wanted to replace your decisions with mine. All I have ever wanted was to be part of this family in a way that felt meaningful. I set the pen down, pressing my fingers lightly against the paper. That was the hardest part to admit, because for so long I had pretended I didn't need that connection, that I was fine standing on the outside looking in. But I wasn't. I never was. After a moment, I picked up the pen again. There is something else I need to tell you, I wrote. And here, everything changed. Because this wasn't just about emotions anymore. This was about the truth I had been carrying for years. Before Richard passed away, he made a decision about something that was meant for Michael and for his family. A piece of land that has been in his family for generations. He left it in my care with the understanding that I would pass it on when the time was right. I could feel my heart pounding as I wrote the next line. I believe that time is now. The words looked simple on the page, but I knew what they carried. Not just value, responsibility, history, hope. The documents are enclosed in this card, I continued. They belong to Michael, but they are meant for both of you, for your family, for your future. I hesitated. There was one more thing, something I hadn't told anyone, not even Michael. Richard believed, I wrote slowly, that this gift should come at a moment when it would bring a family together, not pull it apart. I don't know if we are there yet, but I am choosing to trust that we can be. My hand trembled slightly as I finished the letter. Whatever you decide to do with this, I hope you'll also choose to open the door we've both kept closed for too long. Then after a long pause, I signed it. With love, Beverly, not Mom, not mother-in-law, just Beverly. Because love, I had learned, isn't something you can force someone to accept. You can only offer it. I sat there for a while staring at the letter. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and for the first time in years, that felt like enough. Carefully, I folded the pages and placed them inside the card. Then I reached for the folder. The deed. The very thing Emily had been searching for without even realizing how close it had always been. I slid the documents in behind the letter, making sure everything was secure. For a moment, I held the card in both hands. It felt heavier than it should have, not because of the paper inside, but because of everything it represented. Hope, risk, a chance, or a final rejection. I sealed the envelope slowly, pressing my fingers along the edge, as if that small gesture could somehow protect what was inside. Once it was closed, there was no going back. The next morning, I drove to the post office. The sky was overcast, a soft gray stretching across the horizon. The kind of day that feels quiet, suspended like the world is waiting for something to happen. I stood in line, the envelope clutched in my hand. Around me, people chatted, checked their phones, moved through their routines without a second thought. For them, it was just another morning. For me, it felt like everything was about to change. When it was my turn, I stepped forward and handed the envelope to the clerk. "Just standard delivery?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes." She placed a stamp on it and set it aside with a dozen other letters. Just like that, it was out of my hands. I walked back to my car slowly, my thoughts louder than the quiet street around me. There was no guarantee Emily would open it. No guarantee she would read the letter. No guarantee she would even care. But for the first time in a long time, I had done my part. I had reached out. I had told the truth. And now, all I could do was wait. Waiting is a quiet kind of torture. There are no alarms, no visible signs, no moment where you can point and say, "This is where everything changed." Just time stretching itself thin second by second, while your thoughts fill in the silence with every possible outcome. For 3 days, I told myself I wouldn't think about it. I failed before noon on the 1st. I woke up earlier than usual that morning, the kind of restless waking that doesn't feel like rest at all. The house was too quiet. Even the clock on the wall seemed louder than it should have been, each tick echoing against the emptiness. I made coffee, but forgot to drink it. I sat by the window, watching the street, even though there was nothing to see. And all I could think about was that envelope. Had it arrived? Had Emily seen it? Had she picked it up? Glanced at my name on the front, and set it aside without a second thought. Or had she opened it? I tried to imagine that moment, the slight tear of the paper, the pause before unfolding the card, the way her expression might change as she realized what was inside. Hope is a dangerous thing when you've learned not to expect anything. By the second day, the silence became unbearable. I checked my phone more times than I care to admit. Not because I expected a call I didn't, but because some small, stubborn part of me refused to let go of the possibility. Maybe Michael would call. Maybe Emily would. Maybe something would break the quiet. Nothing did. By the 3rd day, I stopped pretending. I needed to know. Not everything, not the outcome, just something. So I drove over. I told myself it was a coincidence, that I was in the area, that I just wanted to see Ethan. But deep down, I knew the truth. I needed to see that house. I needed to see whether anything had changed. When I pulled up to the curb, the first thing I noticed was the same thing I had seen before. Nothing. No visible change. No sign of relief. No hint that anything had shifted. The yard was still unkempt. The curtains still drawn halfway. The quiet still hanging in the air like a weight that refused to lift. I sat in the car for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than I realized. Maybe I should just leave. Maybe I had done enough. But then I saw movement through the window. Emily. She walked past the kitchen, her expression tight, her posture rigid. She looked exactly the same. Not relieved, not hopeful, not like someone who had just discovered the one thing that could save everything. My stomach dropped. No, she hadn't opened it. I felt it before I even stepped out of the car. Still I got out. Still I walked up to the door. Still I knocked. It took a few seconds before it opened, and when it did, Emily stood there, her face carefully composed into that familiar, distant politeness I had come to know so well. "Beverly," she said, not warm, not cold, just neutral. "Hi, Emily," I replied softly, forcing a small smile. "I was nearby and thought I'd stop by." There was a pause, just long enough to remind me that I wasn't expected. Then she stepped aside. "Come in." The house felt heavy. That was the only word for it. Not messy, not chaotic, just weighed down by something unspoken. Michael sat at the kitchen table again. Papers spread out in front of him. His eyes looked tired, dark circles beneath them. His shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. He looked up when I entered. "Mom," he said, surprised. "Hey." His voice carried something new, relief mixed with guilt. I nodded gently. "Hi, sweetheart." For a moment, no one said anything. The silence stretched between us, filled with everything none of us knew how to say. Then I noticed it. The pile of mail, sitting on the counter, exactly where it had been in my mind. Unopened, untouched. And there, buried halfway beneath a stack of envelopes and flyers, was my card. My breath caught. It was exactly as I had imagined it. Sealed, forgotten, ignored. All those words I had written unread. All that hope I had folded into that envelope unseen. And the deed still hidden inside like it didn't matter. Like I didn't matter. I felt something in my chest tighten sharp and sudden. But I didn't move toward it. I didn't say anything. Because somehow, seeing it like that hurt more than I had prepared for. Emily followed my gaze, and for a split second, just a flicker, I saw something cross her face. Awareness. But it vanished just as quickly. "Sorry, things have been a little busy," she said, casually gesturing toward the counter as if that explained everything. "Busy," I nodded slowly. "I understand, but I didn't. Not really, because no matter how busy life gets, you open a birthday card, don't you?" Michael shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "How have you been, Mom?" he asked. "Fine," I said automatically. The same word we had been using for years to mean everything except the truth. Emily moved toward the sink, pretending to busy herself with dishes that didn't need washing. The distance between us felt wider than ever. And yet, the answer to everything sat just a few feet away. Unopened, untouched, unwanted. I stood there staring at it for a moment longer than I should have. Part of me wanted to walk over, pick it up, and hand it to her. To say, "You need to open this." To force the moment. To end the waiting. But I didn't. Because that wasn't the plan. That wasn't the choice I had made. This had to be hers. Even if it broke my heart. Even if it meant watching the one thing that could save them sit there like it meant nothing at all. I turned away from the counter, swallowing the ache in my chest. We talked for a while after that, or at least we pretended to. Small things, safe things. The weather. Ethan's school. Michael's work, though, he avoided specifics. Not once did either of them mention the card. Not once did Emily reach for it. And with every passing minute, the truth became harder to ignore. She hadn't just forgotten. She had chosen not to care. Eventually, I stood to leave. Well, I said softly, I should get going. Michael walked me to the door. "Thanks for stopping by," he said. There was something in his eyes, something unspoken. But whatever it was, he didn't say it. He never did. I nodded, forcing a small smile. Of course. As I stepped outside, I took one last glance through the open doorway. The card was still there, exactly where it had been. And in that moment, I realized something that hurt more than anything else. It wasn't just that Emily had ignored the card. She had ignored the chance. The chance to understand. The chance to fix things. The chance to see me for who I really was. And just like that, the one thing she desperately needed was the one thing she had chosen to leave unopened. I didn't cry until I got home. Not in the car. Not while I was standing in their doorway pretending everything was fine. Not even when I saw that card lying there like it meant nothing. No. I held it together all the way back, gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white, blinking away the sting in my eyes every time it threatened to spill over. But the moment I stepped inside my house, it broke. I closed the door behind me, leaned my back against it, and let the silence swallow me whole. And then the tears came. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. The kind that comes from somewhere deep, somewhere old. The kind that isn't just about one moment, but every moment that led up to it. I tried, I whispered into the empty room. But the words felt hollow. Because trying doesn't always mean anything if the other person never meets you halfway. I walked slowly into the living room and sank into the chair by the window, the same chair where Richard used to sit every evening, reading the paper, making quiet comments about the world as if it could hear him. For a moment, I could almost imagine him there. And that made it worse. I did what you asked, I said softly, staring at the empty space across from me. I waited. I trusted the timing. My voice trembled. But what if the timing never comes? There was no answer, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, trying to steady myself. Because as much as it hurt, there was something else creeping in beneath the sadness. Something sharper. Anger. Not loud, explosive anger, but quiet, controlled. The kind that builds slowly like pressure behind a closed door. I had given them everything I could. I had stepped back when I was asked to, stayed silent when I was pushed away, waited when I wanted to act. And when I finally found a way to help without forcing myself into their lives, they didn't even look. They didn't even try. Emily didn't even open the card. That thought hit harder than anything else. Not because of the deed, but because of what it represented. A chance. And she had dismissed it without a second thought. I stood up suddenly, pacing the room as the emotions inside me shifted. What am I supposed to do now? I muttered under my breath. Because the truth was, I still had the power to change everything. That deed was still mine. That land was still mine. And with one decision, I could take it off the table entirely. Sell it, transfer it, walk away from it and from them. The idea settled into my mind more easily than I expected. Too easily. Because for the first time in a long time, it felt like control. Not waiting, not hoping, not depending on someone else's choice. Just deciding. I walked over to my desk and opened the drawer where I kept the copies of the documents. The original deed was in the card, yes. But I had made copies out of habit, out of caution, out of something that now felt like instinct. I pulled them out and stared at them. The numbers, the legal descriptions, the signatures. It was all so simple, so clean, unlike everything else. If I sold the land, I could close this chapter. No more waiting. No more wondering if Emily would ever see me differently. No more watching my son struggle while refusing to let me help. I could just let go. And maybe that was what I needed to do. Maybe that was what Richard meant all along. Not to hold on forever, but to know when to stop. I sank back into my chair, the papers still in my hands. The weight of the decision pressing down on me. Because this wasn't just about property. It was about what I was willing to give to people who might never appreciate it. And more importantly, what I was willing to take back. I thought about Michael, about the little boy who used to run into my arms without hesitation, about the man who now sat across from me unable to meet my eyes. He hadn't opened the card either. That realization hurt in a different way. Because unlike Emily, he should have known better. He should have seen it. He should have cared enough to ask. But he didn't. And maybe that was the hardest truth of all. This wasn't just Emily's distance. It was his, too. I let out a slow breath, closing my eyes. If I let this go, I whispered what happens to them. The answer came almost immediately. They would struggle. They might lose the house. They would face the consequences of whatever choices had brought them to this point. And maybe that was something they needed to go through. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because sometimes people don't change until they have no other option. Richard had said it himself. People don't always know what they need until they're forced to face what they might lose. I opened my eyes, staring at the papers again. Was this that moment? Was this the point where I stopped protecting them and let life do what it needed to do? The thought didn't feel cruel. It felt inevitable. For the first time since I sent the card, I felt a strange sense of clarity settle over me. Not peace, not yet, but direction. I couldn't keep standing in the doorway of their lives, offering something they refused to accept. And I couldn't keep holding on to something that was meant for them, if they didn't even care enough to look. So maybe it was time to make a different kind of choice. I reached for my phone. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before I tapped on a contact I hadn't used in years. A real estate agent. Someone Richard had worked with long ago. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice answered. Hello? I swallowed, my heart pounding in a way that surprised me. Hi, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. This is Beverly Chandler. I have a property I'm considering selling. There was a pause on the other end. Well, the man replied, his tone immediately professional. I'd be happy to help you with that. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, because just like that, everything had shifted. Not because Emily opened the card, but because she didn't. And sometimes, the choices people don't make end up changing everything. The next morning felt different. Not lighter, not easier, but decided. There's a quiet shift that happens when you stop waiting for someone else to act and finally choose your own direction. It doesn't erase the pain, but it gives it shape. It gives it purpose. And for the first time in weeks, I knew what I was going to do. At exactly 9 o'clock, my phone rang. "Beverly Chandler," the voice on the other end asked. "Yes," I replied, already knowing who it was. "This is Daniel Harper, returning your call about the property." His voice was calm, practiced. The kind of voice that had handled deals, negotiations, decisions that changed people's lives without ever carrying the emotional weight behind them. "I remember your husband," he added. "Richard was a good man." My chest tightened slightly at the mention of his name. "Yes," I said softly. "He was." There was a brief pause, respectful. "Well," Daniel continued, "you mentioned you were considering selling. Do you have the documents on hand?" "I do." "Good. From what I recall, that land has appreciated quite a bit over the years. Depending on location and zoning, you could be looking at a significant value." Significant value. I glanced down at the papers on my table. Numbers, potential, opportunity. All of it sitting quietly in my hands while my son struggled just miles away. "Yes," I said slowly. "I'd like to move forward." The words came out steadier than I expected. "All right," Daniel replied. "We can start with an evaluation. I'll need to take a look at the property confirmed details and then we can discuss listing options." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "When can you come by?" I asked. "How's tomorrow afternoon?" "That works." We exchanged the details, then hung up. Just like that, it was in motion. I stood there for a moment, the silence settling around me again. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt final. I spent the rest of the morning gathering everything Daniel would need. Documents, copies, old maps Richard had kept tucked away in that same folder for years. As I sorted through them, memories surfaced. Small ones, quiet ones. The way Richard used to talk about the land like it was more than just property. "It's not about the money," he once told me. "It's about what it represents." At the time, I thought he meant legacy. Now, I wasn't so sure. By the afternoon, everything was ready. There was nothing left to do but wait. Again. But this waiting was different. This wasn't about hoping someone else would make a choice. This was about following through on one I had already made. Still, my mind wouldn't stay quiet. Because no matter how much I tried to focus on the logistics, on the paperwork, on the practical side of things, one thought kept pushing its way back to the surface. The card. Still sitting there. Still unopened. Still holding everything they needed and everything they didn't know they were about to lose. I tried to push it away, tried to remind myself that I had given them a chance, that I had done everything I could. But the truth is, it's hard to let go of something when you know exactly what it could fix. That evening, as I sat alone at the dinner table, I found myself staring at my phone again, not expecting a call, not hoping for one, just wondering. What if she opens it tomorrow? What if she reads the letter? What if I stopped myself? No. That door had closed, not because I wanted it to, but because she chose not to open it, and choices have consequences. I pushed my plate away, appetite gone. "I can't keep doing this," I said quietly to myself, because living in what if is its own kind of prison, and I had spent enough years feeling stuck. The next day, Daniel arrived right on time. He was older than I remembered, his hair more gray than brown, but his demeanor hadn't changed. Professional, efficient, kind, but at a distance. We sat at the table as I laid out the documents. He reviewed them carefully, nodding as he flipped through each page. "This is all in order," he said after a few minutes. "Clean title, no complications." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "That's good," I replied. He looked up at me, then studying my face for a moment longer than necessary. "May I ask," he said gently, "why you're choosing to sell now?" The question caught me off guard, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I had too many. I could have said it was practical, that it was time, that I didn't need the property anymore, but none of those would have been the truth. So instead, I chose the simplest version of it. "Because the people it was meant for." I paused, my voice tightening slightly. "Don't want it." Daniel didn't respond right away. He just nodded slowly, as if he understood more than I had said. "Well," he said, after a moment, "well, make sure it goes to someone who does." Something about that sentence settled heavily in my chest, because for the first time, it felt real. Not just an idea, not just a possibility, but something that was actually going to happen. He stood up, gathering his things. "I'll get the evaluation started," he said. "We should have numbers within a few days." I walked him to the door. "Thank you," I said. "Of course," he replied. "I'll be in touch." As I watched him drive away, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was grief. Not for the land, but for what it was supposed to mean. I turned back toward the house, stepping inside slowly. And for the first time since all of this began, I didn't look at my phone. I didn't think about the card. I didn't wonder what Emily was doing. Because for the first time, I was no longer waiting for her to choose. I already had, and sometimes, that's the moment everything truly begins to change. 2 days passed, then 3, and just when I thought I had finally settled into the quiet acceptance of my decision, everything changed. It was late afternoon when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it, not because I didn't recognize the number. I did. It was Michael's, but because something inside me hesitated. A small, instinctive pause that whispered, "This won't be simple." Still, I picked it up. "Hello?" There was breathing on the other end, not silence breathing, uneven, tight. "Mom." Michael's voice came through strained in a way I had never heard before. My heart dropped instantly. "What is it?" I asked, already sitting up straighter, my hand gripping the phone. There was a pause. Then, "Did you send something to the house?" Everything inside me stilled. The card." My eyes closed slowly. "Yes." "What is it?" I asked, already sitting up straighter, my hand gripping the phone. There was a pause. Then, "Did you send something to the house?" Everything inside me stilled. The card. My eyes closed slowly. "Yes," I said. "I did." Another pause, longer this time, and then his voice came back lower. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question hit harder than I expected, because it wasn't anger. It was something else, something closer to regret. "I tried," I replied quietly, "in the only way I thought you'd accept." I could hear him exhale like the air had been knocked out of him. "Mom," he started, but then stopped. In the background, I heard something else. A voice. Emily. Not calm, not controlled, panicked. You need to call her back, she was saying, her voice sharp, breaking in a way I had never heard before. You need to fix this. My stomach tightened. Fix this! Michael lowered his voice, but I could still hear the tension. We opened it, he said. Finally. Finally. But the relief I thought I would feel didn't come. Because something in his tone told me this wasn't the moment I had imagined. And? I asked carefully. There was a silence so heavy it felt like it pressed through the phone. Then, Mom. Why would you put something like that in a birthday card? I blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean? I asked. Emily thought it was just a card, he said, his voice rising slightly. It sat there for days. We didn't. I know, I said softly, cutting him off. That silence again. Thicker now, more uncomfortable. Then Emily's voice came through louder this time. Because she wanted to prove a point. She snapped. I froze. That wasn't what I expected. Not gratitude, not shock, accusation. Michael tried to quiet her, but she didn't stop. No, let her hear it. Emily continued, her voice shaking with emotion. You send something like that and just expect us to magically understand what it means. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice steady. I explained everything in the letter. You think that fixes it? Emily shot back. You think hiding something that important for years and then dropping it on us like it's some kind of test is fair? Test. The word echoed in my mind. That's what she thought this was. A test. I closed my eyes, taking a slow breath. It wasn't a test, I said quietly. Then what was it? She demanded. The question hung there, heavy, because the answer wasn't simple. It was a choice, I said finally. There was a pause. A choice Michael repeated. Yes, I said. One I made a long time ago and one I gave to you when I sent that card. Emily let out a short, disbelieving laugh. That's convenient, she muttered. Something inside me shifted. Not anger, but something firmer, stronger. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to be understood. I was simply telling the truth. You didn't open it, I said calmly. Not for days. Neither of them responded. You walked past it. I continued, my voice steady but quiet. Again and again. And that told me everything I needed to know. That's not fair, Emily snapped. Isn't it? I asked gently. Silence. I could hear her breathing now, sharp, uneven. You didn't even know what it was, she said, her voice dropping slightly. It could have been anything. Yes, I replied, and that's exactly the point. Michael spoke, then his voice softer. Mom, we've been dealing with a lot. I know, I said. Then why wouldn't you just tell us, he asked. There it was, the question that had been sitting beneath everything. Why didn't I just hand it over? Why didn't I make it easy? I took a slow breath. Because your father didn't want it to be easy, I said. The line went quiet again. He believed, I continued, that something like this should come at a moment when it would bring a family together, not when it would be taken for granted. Emily let out a small, frustrated sound. So we're being punished, she said. No, I replied firmly. You're being given a choice. Another silence, but this one felt different, less defensive, more uncertain. Michael spoke again, his voice quieter now. Mom, we need that land. The words landed exactly where they were meant to. Not as a demand, as a truth. I know you do, I said. Then please, he added, his voice breaking slightly, don't take it away from us. My grip on the phone tightened. Because this was the moment everything had been building toward. Not the card, not the waiting, but this. The point where they finally said what they needed. But here's the thing about timing. It doesn't always come when you want it to. I closed my eyes briefly. There's something I need to tell you, I said. A pause. What Michael asked. I've already started the process of selling the land. Silence. Not just quiet. Shock. I could almost feel it through the phone. You did what Emily's voice came through sharp and disbelieving. I made a decision, I said. You can't do that, she snapped. That land belongs to me, I interrupted gently. That stopped her, completely. For now, I added. Michael's voice came next, low and strained. Mom, please tell me you haven't signed anything yet. I hesitated. Because this was the edge, the turning point, the place where everything could still change or fall apart completely. Not yet, I said. And in that moment, the silence that followed wasn't filled with anger or accusation. It was filled with something new. Fear. Real fear. Because for the first time, they understood what was truly at stake. And this time, there was no unopened envelope to ignore. Silence has many forms. There is the kind that feels peaceful, and then there is the kind that presses down on you heavy and suffocating, forcing you to face something you've been avoiding. The silence after I told them I was selling the land was the second kind. No one spoke for a long moment. Not me, not Michael, not even Emily. And for the first time since this conversation began, the control had shifted. They weren't questioning me anymore. They were reacting. Mom. Michael's voice finally came through strained, almost unsteady. You can't just decide that without talking to us. I closed my eyes briefly. I did try to talk to you, I said gently, in a way that respected the space you've both made very clear you needed. That's not the same thing, Emily cut in quickly. You don't send something like that in the mail and call it communication. Her tone still carried frustration, but underneath it now was something else. Desperation. And that changed everything. Because this wasn't about control anymore. This was about losing something they suddenly realized they couldn't afford to lose. You didn't open it, I said quietly. I didn't know what it was, she snapped back. And that didn't matter enough to check. I asked, not accusing, just asking. That question lingered, unanswered, because there was no good answer. Michael exhaled heavily. Mom, please, he said. We're asking you now. We're telling you we need it. Doesn't that count for something? I leaned back in my chair, gripping the phone just a little tighter. Of course it counted. Every word he said mattered to me. But there was something deeper at play now. Something I couldn't ignore. It does, I said. But it also tells me something else. What Emily asked sharply. That you didn't need me until you needed what I had. The words came out softer than they felt, and yet they landed exactly where they needed to. The silence that followed wasn't defensive this time. It was uncomfortable, because it was true. Michael spoke again, slower now. That's not fair, Mom. Maybe not, I admitted, but it's honest. Another pause. I could almost hear the shift happening on the other end of the line. The way people adjust when they realize the conversation isn't going the way they expected. Okay, I could almost hear the shift happening on the other end of the line. The way people adjust when they realize the conversation isn't going the way they expected. Okay, Emily said finally, her voice different now. Quieter, more controlled. Let's say we made a mistake. I didn't respond. I let her continue. We should have opened the card sooner, she admitted. Fine, that's on me. That alone surprised me. Not because she admitted fault, but because she said it out loud. To you, she added after a brief pause. There it was again. Carefully measured, still guarded, but closer to honesty than I had heard from her in years. But that doesn't mean you get to take something like this away from us. She continued, her voice tightening slightly again. This isn't just about feelings. This is our home, our life, and mine, I said softly. That stopped her, because that was the part she never seemed to see. This wasn't just their story. It was mine, too. I didn't hide this from you to hurt you, I continued. I didn't wait all these years just to make a point. I was honoring something your father-in-law believed in. I didn't hide this from you to hurt you, I continued. I didn't wait all these years just to make a point. I was honoring something your father-in-law believed in, which is what she asked. I took a slow breath. That timing matters, I said, and that something like this should bring people together, not just fix a problem. Michael's voice came through again. And what if it can do both? He asked. That question lingered, because it wasn't defensive. It wasn't angry. It was hopeful, and that was new. What if this is the moment, he added? What if this is exactly when we need it? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of his words, because part of me wanted to believe that, wanted to say yes, wanted to undo everything and hand it over without another thought. But another part of me, the part that had waited, the part that had watched, the part that had been quietly pushed aside for years, that part needed more. This isn't just about the land, I said finally. Then what is it about? Emily asked, her voice softer now. I hesitated, because this was the truth I hadn't said out loud before. Not like this. It's about whether we're a family, I said. The words hung there, simple, but heavier than anything else I had said. Another long silence followed, but this time it wasn't empty. It was reflective, uncomfortable, but real. I thought we were, Michael said quietly. I felt something in my chest tighten. So did I replied. And that was the truth. I had believed it for a long time, even when it didn't feel like it, even when the distance grew, even when I became someone they tolerated instead of someone they welcomed. But families don't ignore each other, I continued gently. They don't shut each other out until something goes wrong. No one argued with that, because they couldn't. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. Less like a wall, more like a space where something could finally be said if someone was brave enough to say it. And then Emily spoke. Not defensive, not sharp, just quiet. I didn't think you cared. The words were so soft, I almost didn't hear them. But when I did, everything inside me shifted. Because that was the first honest thing she had said. I swallowed, my throat tightening. I always cared, I said. Another pause. I just didn't know how to show it in a way you would accept. Silence again, but not the same kind. This silence felt fragile, like something was finally breaking open after being held shut for too long. I thought you were judging me, Emily said after a moment. I let out a small, sad breath. I thought you didn't want me in your life, I replied. Another pause, and then, for the first time since I had known her, she said something that changed everything. "I didn't know how to let you in." The words were simple, but they carried years of distance, misunderstanding, and unspoken fear. And suddenly, this wasn't about the land anymore. It wasn't about the card. It wasn't even about the mistake of not opening it. It was about everything that had led to that moment. Everything that had gone unsaid. Everything that had been assumed instead of understood. I leaned back in my chair, my grip on the phone loosening slightly. Because for the first time, we weren't arguing. We were finally talking. And maybe, just maybe, that was the moment Richard had been waiting for all along. There's a fragile moment in every difficult conversation. A moment where everything could either fall apart or finally come together. And I could feel it right there, hanging between us. No one spoke for several seconds after Emily said she didn't know how to let me in. But this silence wasn't heavy like before. It was careful, like all of us were suddenly aware that one wrong word could shatter something that had just begun to form. I was the one who broke it. Then maybe we can start now. Like all of us were suddenly aware that one wrong word could shatter something that had just begun to form. I was the one who broke it. Then maybe we can start now. My voice was soft, but steady. And for the first time, it didn't feel like I was reaching toward a closed door. It felt like I was standing in front of one that had finally been unlocked, even if only a little. Emily didn't respond right away. I could hear her breathing on the other end, slower now, less sharp. I don't know how she admitted quietly. And that honesty, it changed everything. Because for years, I had assumed her distance was rejection. But now, I was beginning to understand it might have been fear. "I don't expect you to know how," I said gently. I didn't know either. That seemed to surprise her. "I made mistakes too," I continued. "More than I probably realize. I thought giving you space meant I was respecting you. But maybe it just made you feel like I didn't care." Another pause, and then quietly, it did. The word hit me harder than anything else she had said, because it was simple and completely honest. I swallowed, my throat tightening. "I'm sorry," I said. Not carefully, not defensively, just honestly. And for the first time. There was no resistance on the other end. Michael spoke, then his voice softer than I had heard it in years. "This is a lot," he said. I let out a small breath. "I know." "No," he added gently. "I mean this whole thing. The card, the land, everything you've been holding on to." There was no accusation in his voice, just realization, and maybe a little guilt. "I didn't want it to be like this," I admitted. "I wanted to give it to you at a time when it would feel like something good, not something desperate." Emily spoke again. "It doesn't feel desperate," she said quietly. That surprised me. "It feels," she hesitated, searching for the right word. "Complicated." I almost smiled. "That's fair," I said. Because it was. Nothing about this was simple. Not the past, not the distance, not the choices we had all made. "And I don't want to lose it," she added quickly, her voice tightening again. But this time, not with anger, with fear. "I know," I said softly. "And I don't want to lose this either," she continued, her voice dropping. "Whatever this is right now." That was the moment everything shifted. Because she wasn't just talking about the land anymore. She was talking about us, the conversation, the fragile connection forming between us. the possibility of something different. And suddenly, the decision I thought I had already made didn't feel as certain anymore. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling as I let her words settle in. Because this was what Richard had meant. Not the perfect moment, not a moment without conflict, but a moment where something real finally surfaced. A moment where people stopped pretending, stopped avoiding, and started choosing. Choosing to speak, choosing to listen, choosing to try. I closed my eyes briefly. "Emily," I said gently. "Yes, if I don't sell the land." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "It can't just go back to the way things were." There was no hesitation this time. "It won't," she said immediately. Her voice was firm, certain, and that alone told me more than anything else. "Because I can't keep being someone who only exists when something goes wrong," I continued. "You won't be," she said again, quieter this time. Michael spoke next. "We'll fix this, Mom," he said. "All of it." I let out a small breath. "I don't need everything to be fixed," I said. "I just need it to be real." Another pause, but this one felt grounded, like we were finally standing on something solid. "So what happens now?" Emily asked. That was the question, wasn't it? The one everything had been leading to. I glanced down at the papers still spread across my table. The copies, the evidence of a decision I had already set in motion. "I have a meeting in a few days," I said. "Nothing is finalized yet." Silence. Hopeful. Careful. "But if I stop the process," I continued, "I need to know that this isn't just about the land." "It's not," Michael said immediately. Emily didn't speak right away, and for a moment, I wondered if she would. Then, "It's not," she said quietly, and somehow, that felt even more meaningful, because she didn't rush to say it. She chose to. I think I hesitated, something unexpected forming in my mind. "I think we need to do this in person." Michael exhaled. "Yeah," he said. "We do." Emily didn't argue. When she asked, I looked out the window, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the yard. "Tomorrow," I said, "at my house." Another pause, but this one felt different. Not uncertain, just significant. Like we all understood what that meant. "He'll be there." "Tomorrow," I said, "at my house." Another pause, but this one felt different. Not uncertain, just significant. Like we all understood what that meant. "He'll be there," Michael said. A beat. Then Emily's voice followed. "Me too." I nodded slowly, even though they couldn't see me. "All right," I said. The call ended shortly after that. No dramatic goodbye, no sudden resolution, just an agreement, a quiet step forward. I sat there for a long time after the line went silent, my phone still in my hand, my thoughts moving slower than they had in days, because nothing had been decided yet. Not really. The land was still in my name. The sale was still in motion. The past was still complicated, but something had changed. Not in a loud, obvious way, but in the only way that really matters. We had finally stopped avoiding each other. And sometimes, that's the first real step toward healing. Tomorrow would decide everything. Not just what happened to the land, but what happened to us. The next morning felt heavier than any before it. Not because I was afraid of what might happen, but because I knew something would happen. There are days in life that pass quietly unnoticed. And then there are days that feel like crossroads where everything you've carried, Everything you've avoided, everything you've hoped for, finally meets in one place. This was one of those days. I woke up early, long before the sun had fully risen. The house was still wrapped in that soft gray light that makes everything feel suspended between night and morning. For a moment, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence, preparing myself. Because today wasn't about a phone call. It wasn't about distance or misunderstandings hidden behind polite words. Today, we were going to sit in the same room, face to face. No more space to hide in. I got up slowly, moving through my routine with more care than usual. Coffee breakfast, though I barely ate, straightening the house, adjusting things that didn't really need adjusting. I caught myself wiping the same countertop twice, then 3 times. "You're stalling," I murmured to myself. And I was right, because no matter how ready I thought I was, there's nothing quite like the moment before everything changes. By the time the clock reached 10, my nerves had settled into something quieter. Not calm, but steady. A knock came at exactly 10:15, right on time. I froze for just a second, then I walked to the door and opened it. Michael stood there first. He looked different, not physically, but in the way he held himself. Less guarded, more aware. Behind him stood Emily. She looked nervous, not defensive, not distant, just unsure. And that alone told me how much had already shifted. "Hi, Mom," Michael said softly. "Hi," I replied. My eyes moved to Emily. "Beverly?" She said, her voice quiet but respectful. No tension, no sharp edge, just my name. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. They walked in slowly, taking in the space like it was unfamiliar, even though they had been here before. Maybe it was unfamiliar, because the last time we stood in this house, we weren't like this. We sat in the living room, the same place where I had cried just days before. Only now the silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything we hadn't said yet. I didn't rush it, neither did they. For a few moments, we just sat there, breathing, adjusting. Then Michael spoke first. "I'm sorry," he said. The words came quickly, like he had been holding them back. "For not opening the card. For not noticing." I looked at him carefully, and I saw it. Not guilt alone, understanding. "I appreciate that," I said gently. Then Emily spoke. "I'm sorry too." That meant more than I expected, because she didn't say it out of obligation. She said it because she chose to. I thought. She hesitated, searching for the words. "I thought it was just a card." I know I said. But I also didn't open it because she paused again, her voice tightening slightly. "Because I didn't expect anything from you." That truth landed softly but deeply. Not cruel, just honest, and maybe necessary. "I understand that," I replied. She looked up at me, then her eyes uncertain. "I didn't think you saw me," she admitted. I felt something in my chest shift again. "I always saw you," I said quietly. "I just didn't know how to reach you." The room fell silent again. But this silence, it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was reflective, like we were finally hearing each other, without the noise of assumptions. Michael leaned forward slightly. "Mom, about the land," he said carefully. There it was. "The thing we couldn't avoid." I nodded. "I haven't signed anything yet," I said. Relief flickered across his face instantly. Emily's shoulders loosened just slightly. But I added, and both of them stilled again, "This isn't just about stopping the sale." They both nodded. They understood that now. I stood up slowly and walked over to my desk. The folder was still there. The copies. The weight of everything this decision carried. I picked it up and brought it back to the table, placing it in front of them. "This is what was in the card," I said. Neither of them reached for it right away. Not like before. This time, they were careful. Intentional. Emily was the one who finally opened it. Her hands moved slower than I expected, almost like she understood now that this wasn't just paperwork. It was trust. She looked through the documents quietly. Michael leaned in beside her, and as they read, I watched. Not for their reaction to the value, not for excitement, but for something else. Respect, understanding, connection. After a few minutes, Emily looked up. Her expression wasn't what I had imagined days ago. There was no triumph, no relief-driven smile, just seriousness. "This is a lot," she said softly. "Yes," I replied. She hesitated. Then, "Why me?" she said softly. "Because you're the one who can make a difference." Eep lied. She hesitated. Then, "Why me?" she asked. That question surprised me. "Why give this to us?" she clarified. After everything, I took a slow breath. "Because your family," I said. Simple, but true. "And because your father-in-law believed in second chances." Her eyes softened slightly at that. Michael looked down at the papers again. "We don't deserve this, because you're family," I said. Simple, but true. "And because your father-in-law believed in second chances." Her eyes softened slightly at that. Michael looked down at the papers again. "We don't deserve this," he said quietly. I shook my head gently. "It's not about deserving," I said. "It's about what you do with it." Another silence, but this one felt steady, grounded, like we were finally standing on something real. Emily closed the folder slowly. "I don't want this to be the only reason things change between us," she said. "It won't be," I replied, "because now I believed that. Not because everything was fixed, but because something had finally started. Something real, something honest, something that didn't depend on a piece of paper." I looked at both of them. "So here's what happens next," I said, and for the first time, they weren't waiting to react. They were ready to listen. I didn't rush my answer, because for years, everything between us had been rushed in the wrong ways. Quick assumptions, quick judgments, quick withdrawals when things became uncomfortable. This time, I wanted it to be different. I folded my hands gently in my lap and looked at both of them, really looked. Not as the people who had hurt me, not as the ones who had kept their distance, but as the family I still had. "This doesn't go back to the way it was," I said slowly, "because the way it was wasn't working." Michael nodded immediately. Emily didn't speak, but I could see it in her eyes. She understood. I'm not going to hold this over you." I continued, placing a hand lightly on the folder. "But I'm also not going to pretend that everything is suddenly fine just because we're sitting here talking. You." I continued, placing a hand lightly on the folder. "But I'm also not going to pretend that everything is suddenly fine just because we're sitting here talking." "That's fair," Michael said quietly. Emily hesitated, then added, "It is." There was a softness in her voice now. Not weakness, not guilt, just openness, and that was new. "So this is what I need," I said. They both leaned in slightly. Listening, Not reacting, listening. I need to know that I'm part of your lives, I said. Not just when things are falling apart, not just when you need something, but in the everyday moments. Emily looked down briefly. Michael didn't look away. I need to be able to call you without feeling like I'm interrupting, I continued. To visit without feeling like I'm being tolerated. My voice didn't break, but it came close. And I need to know that Ethan grows up knowing me not just as someone who stops by occasionally, but as his grandmother. That was the part that mattered most. More than the land, more than the past, more than everything. Because time doesn't wait for families to figure things out. Ethan was growing up, and I didn't want to miss it. Michael swallowed hard. You won't, he said. I promise. Emily didn't speak right away, and for a moment, I wondered if this was where she would pull back again. But then she looked up, and this time, she didn't hesitate. You're right, she said. 3 simple words, but they carried more weight than any apology. I did push you away. She continued, her voice steady. Not because I didn't want you around, but because I didn't know how to share that space. I stayed quiet, letting her say it. All my life I've had to figure things out on my own, she went on. I didn't grow up with this. She gestured lightly between us. With family that stays close. Something inside me softened. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't just about how she treated me. It was about what she had never learned how to do. I thought if I let you in, she continued, you'd take over, or judge me, or make me feel like I wasn't doing enough. I shook my head gently. I never wanted that, I said. I know that now, she replied. And that was the difference. Not perfection, understanding. Michael leaned back slightly, exhaling. We should have figured this out a long time ago, he said. Maybe, I replied. But we didn't, and there was no use pretending otherwise. We're here now, Emily said quietly. I looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, I didn't see distance. I didn't see resistance. I saw someone trying, and that mattered more than anything else. I reached forward and gently pushed the folder toward them. This belongs to your future, I said. Neither of them touched it immediately. Again, that hesitation. But this time, it wasn't avoidance. It was respect. You're sure? Michael asked. I nodded. Yes. Emily's eyes flickered between me and the folder. I don't want to take this and then go back to how things were, she said. You won't, I replied. Not because I was certain, but because I believed her. And sometimes, belief is the first step to making something real. She slowly reached out and placed her hand on the folder. Not grabbing it, not pulling it toward herself, just touching it, like she understood what it meant now. Not just the value, but the trust. I want to do this right, she said. Then we will, I answered. Michael let out a small breath, almost like he had been holding it in for days. Thank you, Mom, he said. And this time, it didn't feel like a polite phrase. It felt real. We sat there for a while after that, not rushing to leave, not filling the silence with unnecessary words, just being there, together. And for the first time in years. It didn't feel like I was sitting across from strangers. It felt like something was finally being rebuilt. Not perfectly, not instantly, but honestly. After a while, Emily stood up. I should check on Ethan, she said. He's at home with his homework? I smiled faintly. Tell him I said hello. I will, she replied. There was a small pause. Then, would you like to come by later this week? She asked. For dinner? The question caught me off guard. Not because it was complicated, but because it was simple. And for so long, nothing between us had been simple. I'd like that, I said. And I meant it. Michael smiled, a genuine one this time. Good, he said. They gathered their things, but neither of them rushed toward the door. There was no urgency to leave, no invisible wall pushing us apart, just a quiet understanding that something had changed. At the door, Emily hesitated. Then she turned back slightly. Beverly. I looked at her. Thank you, she said. Not for the land, not just for the help, but for something deeper. Something we both understood without needing to explain. You're welcome, I replied softly. And as I watched them walk to their car, something inside me settled. Not completely, not all at once, but enough. Because the truth is, the land was never the real gift. It was just the reason we finally stopped pretending. And sometimes, that's what it takes to bring a family back together. A week passed, not the kind that rushes by unnoticed, but the kind where every small moment feels like it matters. And for the first time in a long time, I found myself paying attention to those moments again. The call from Daniel Harper came on Tuesday morning. Right on schedule. Beverly, he said, his voice calm and professional as always. I've completed the evaluation. The property is worth more than we initially expected. There's already interest if you decide to list. I stood by the kitchen window as he spoke, looking out at the quiet street. Cars passing, neighbors walking their dogs, life moving forward as it always does. That's good to know, I replied. There was a pause on the line. Are you ready to move forward? He asked. The question was simple, but it carried everything. The past week, the conversation, the shift that had begun not just in them, but in me. I could have said yes. A week ago, I would have. I had been certain that letting go was the only way to protect myself. Certain that stepping back meant walking away. But things weren't the same anymore. Not because everything was fixed, but because something had changed. Something real. I'm going to hold off for now, I said. There was no hesitation in my voice. No doubt. Understood, Daniel replied. If anything changes, just let me know. I will, I said. We hung up shortly after that, and as I lowered the phone, I didn't feel like I was losing something. I felt like I was choosing something. There's a difference. A quiet, but important one. Later that afternoon, I found myself standing in front of Michael and Emily's house. Again, but this time, it felt different. Not like I was stepping into a space where I didn't quite belong. Not like I had to prepare myself for distance or discomfort. Just a visit. A simple, ordinary visit. I knocked. The door opened almost immediately. Ethan stood there, his small face lighting up the moment he saw me. Grandma! He exclaimed, throwing his arms around me before I could even say hello. I laughed softly, wrapping my arms around him. Hi, sweetheart. That moment alone, it was worth everything. Emily appeared behind him, wiping her hands on a dish towel. You made it, she said, her tone warm. Not forced, not careful, just natural. I did, I replied, smiling. She stepped aside. Come in. Emily appeared behind him, wiping her hands on a dish towel. You made it, she said, her tone warm. Not forced, not careful, just natural. I did, I replied, smiling. She stepped aside. Come in. And this time, there was no hesitation. No invisible line I felt like I shouldn't cross. I walked in like I belonged there, because maybe I finally did. The house felt different too, not physically, but emotionally. Lighter, more open. Dinner was already halfway prepared. The smell of something warm and familiar filled the kitchen. Chicken pot pie, Emily said when she noticed me looking. I wasn't sure if you'd like it, but I love it, I said, cutting her off gently. She smiled. A real one, not guarded, not polite, just genuine. Michael came in from the living room holding his phone. Hey, Mom, he said. Glad you're here. Me too, I replied. And I meant it. Dinner wasn't perfect. There were pauses, moments where the conversation slowed or shifted awkwardly. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was real. Ethan talked about school, about a drawing he made about a friend who wouldn't share crayons. We listened. We laughed. And for the first time, I wasn't watching from the outside. I was part of it. At one point, Emily stood up to grab something from the kitchen, then paused. Beverly, she said, turning slightly. Yes. Would you mind helping me with the gravy? The question was small. Simple. But it meant everything. Of course, I said, standing up. In the kitchen, we worked side by side. Not talking much at first, just being there. Then she spoke. I meant what I said, she said quietly. About doing this right. I nodded. I know. She stirred the pot slowly. I'm not going to get everything right, she added. I'm not either, I replied. That made her smile faintly. I guess that makes two of us. We brought the food back to the table together. And something about that moment, it felt like a beginning. Not a perfect one, but a real one. After dinner, Michael pulled out the folder again. The same one, but it didn't feel heavy anymore. About the land, he said carefully. I looked at him. Yes. We talked about it, he continued. We don't want to rush into anything. Emily nodded beside him. We want to use it wisely, she added. Not just fix things short term, but build something stable. I listened, and I felt something settle inside me. Pride, not in what I had given them, but in what they were choosing to do with it. That's exactly what your father would have wanted, I said softly. Michael looked down briefly, then back up. I wish you were here, he said. So do I replied. Emily glanced at me. But I think he'd be proud of you, she said. The words caught me off guard. Not because they were unexpected, but because they came from her. And for a moment, I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Because sometimes, words aren't necessary. That night as I drove home, I realized something. The card had done what it was meant to do. Not because of what was inside it, but because of what it revealed. The distance, the misunderstandings, the unspoken fears, and most importantly, the willingness to change. I pulled into my driveway and sat there for a moment before getting out. The house was quiet when I stepped inside. But it didn't feel empty anymore. Because for the first time in a long time, I knew I wasn't alone. Not really. Some things take time. Some things take patience. And some things take a moment of truth that changes everything. And sometimes that moment comes from something as simple as a card left unopened. It's strange how life doesn't announce its endings or its beginnings. There's no music swelling in the background, no clear moment where everything shifts from broken to whole. Instead, it happens quietly, in small choices, in ordinary days, in moments that don't seem important until you look back and realize they changed everything. 3 months passed, not perfectly, not without awkward conversations or small missteps, but consistently. And that made all the difference. I found myself at their house more often, not just for dinner, but for the little things. Helping Ethan with his reading, sitting on the couch while Emily folded laundry, talking with Michael in the garage about things that had nothing to do with problems or responsibilities. Just life. One afternoon, I watched Ethan run across the backyard, his laughter carrying through the air as Michael chased after him. Emily stood beside me on the porch, arms crossed lightly, a small smile on her face. "He's getting faster," she said. "He gets that from his father," I replied. She glanced at me. "Michael says you used to run with him when he was little." I smiled faintly. "I tried to keep up." She laughed softly. And it wasn't forced. It wasn't careful. It was easy. That's what surprised me the most. How something that once felt so complicated could become simple. Not because the past disappeared, but because we stopped letting it control every moment. Inside the house, the folder sat on the kitchen counter, still there, but no longer the center of everything. Michael and Emily had taken their time. They met with advisors, talked through options, made plans, not rushed, not desperate, but thoughtful. And for the first time, I saw them building something. Not just fixing something broken, but creating something stable. One evening, Michael sat down beside me after dinner. "We finalized the plans," he said. I looked at him. "For the land?" He nodded. "We're going to build a small rental property on part of it. Something manageable. Something that brings steady income." I listened carefully. "And the rest?" I asked. Emily joined us, sitting across from me. "We're keeping part of it untouched," she said, "as a place for Ethan, for the future." My heart softened. "That sounds like a good balance," I said. "It feels right," Michael replied. And I believed him, because this time, it wasn't about urgency. It was about intention. Emily hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "We also wanted to ask you something." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "What is it?" She exchanged a quick glance with Michael, then looked back at me. "Would you like to help us design it?" The question caught me off guard. "Design it," I repeated. "The property," she clarified. "You and Richard bought it together. You know it better than anyone." I blinked. Because that wasn't just an invitation. It was inclusion. Real inclusion. "I'd like that," I said softly. And I meant it, more than they probably realized, because this wasn't about control. It wasn't about ownership. It was about being part of something again. Weeks turned into months, and slowly the land became something new, not just in structure, but in meaning. We visited it together, walked through the open space, talking about ideas, possibilities, memories. At one point, I stood there quietly, looking out over the land Richard had loved so much. Emily came up beside me. "It's beautiful," she said. "Yes," I replied. "I understand now," she added. I glanced at her. "Understand what?" "Why you waited," she said. "Why it mattered." I nodded slowly. "It wasn't about the land," I said. "I know," she replied. We stood there in silence for a moment, but it wasn't the kind of silence that used to exist between us. This one was peaceful, connected. "Beverly," she said after a while. "Yes, I'm glad I opened that card." I smiled faintly. "So am I. But the truth is, It wasn't just about opening the card. It was about everything that came after. The conversation, the honesty, the willingness to face what we had avoided for so long. Because the card alone didn't fix anything. It just revealed what needed to be fixed. And gave us a choice. A choice to keep going the way we had, or to do something different. One evening, as I sat in my living room, I found myself holding that same birthday card again. Not the copy, the original. The one that had sat unopened for days. The one that almost changed everything for the worse. I ran my fingers gently over the envelope, and then I smiled. Because now, when I looked at it, I didn't see rejection. I didn't see distance. I saw a turning point. A moment where everything could have fallen apart, but didn't. Because we chose differently. I placed the card back on the table and leaned back in my chair. The house was quiet, but not empty. Not anymore, because now I had somewhere to go. People who welcomed me, a family that wasn't perfect, but was real. And sometimes that's more than enough. Because at the end of the day, it's not about the things we give or the things we receive. It's about the connections we choose to build, the walls we decide to tear down, and the moments we're brave enough to face the truth. Even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's late, because it's never really too late. If you're willing to open what's been sitting right in front of you all along. After everything that happened, I've realized something I wish I had understood much earlier in life. We often think love should be obvious, that if someone cares, we'll feel it instantly, that if we matter, we won't have to question it. But the truth is, love doesn't always show up in ways we recognize. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's patient. And sometimes it's waiting for the right moment to be understood. I spent years believing that giving space was the same as showing respect. Emily spent years believing that keeping distance was the same as protecting herself. And Michael stood somewhere in between trying to hold everything together without knowing how. None of us were wrong, but none of us were fully right either. Because relationships aren't built on assumptions. They're built on communication. On choosing to speak even when it's uncomfortable. On choosing to listen even when it's easier to turn away. That unopened card. It wasn't just a missed moment. It was a reflection of everything we hadn't been saying to each other. And once it was opened, we couldn't ignore it anymore. We had to face it. And that's where change begins. Not in perfect situations, not in easy conversations, but in honest ones. So, if you're listening to this right now, I want to ask you something. Is there something in your life you've been avoiding? A conversation you've been putting off? A relationship that feels distant but not completely lost? Maybe it's time to open that card. Maybe it's time to take that first step, even if it feels small, because you never know, that one moment of honesty might be the beginning of something you thought you had already lost. If this story touched you in any way, I'd really love to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment like this? A turning point that changed everything in your family? Leave a comment and share your story. And if you're watching from somewhere in the world, tell me where you are and what time it is for you right now. I always find that so special. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more stories like this. Stories about real life, real emotions, and the kind of moments that remind us what truly matters. Because sometimes the smallest things carry the biggest meaning.